Picture this: you're standing in the grand halls of ancient Rome, surrounded by marble statues and the murmur of senators. The air is thick with tension, not just from political intrigue, but from something far more unsettling: the whispered warnings of priests, the frantic scrambles to interpret a bird's flight, the way even the mightiest emperor might freeze in fear at the sound of thunder. This wasn't just a world of logic and conquest. It was a world where every shadow could hide a divine omen, where the fate of an empire could hinge on something as trivial as a stray dog crossing the road. Today, we're stepping into that world where superstition wasn't just folklore, it was law. The Roman Empire, for all its military might and architectural marvels, was a place where rationality often took a backseat to the irrational. Emperors, those men who held the power of life and death over millions, were often the most superstitious of all. They consulted astrologers before battles, trembled at eclipses, and rearranged entire state ceremonies because of a bad dream. These weren't just quirks, they were forces that shaped history. A single misinterpreted omen could spark a rebellion, delay a war, or even doom a ruler to assassination. And the deeper you dig, the more astonishing it becomes. These weren't just personal fears. They were woven into the very fabric of Roman politics, religion, and daily life. So why did these larger-than-life figures, who commanded armies and built monuments to their own glory, live in such terror of the unseen? What made a man like Augustus, the first emperor, refuse to leave his house on certain days of the year, or Caligula, infamous for his cruelty, dissolve into panic at the sight of a comet? The answers lie in a web of belief so pervasive that even the most skeptical minds of the time couldn't escape them. Over the next 24 revelations, we'll uncover the darkest, most bizarre superstitions that controlled Rome's rulers, from the chilling rituals performed in secret to the public spectacles designed to appease the gods. This isn't just a history lesson, it's a journey into the minds of emperors who ruled the world but were ruled by fear. So settle in, because what you're about to discover will change how you see ancient Rome forever. Imagine staking the fate of your empire, not on battle strategies or political alliances, but on whether a flock of birds decided to fly left or right that morning. To the Romans, this wasn't just superstition, it was state policy. Augury, the practice of reading divine will through the flight patterns of birds, was so deeply ingrained that even the most powerful emperors dared not ignore it. The augurs, Rome's priestly interpreters of the skies, held sway over military campaigns, senate meetings, and imperial coronations. A single unfavorable sign could halt an army in its tracks or postpone a critical vote for weeks. Take Augustus, Rome's first emperor, who famously delayed his own military campaigns multiple times because the birds refused to cooperate. On one occasion, a woodpecker landing on his tent was enough to send his entire army into a frenzy of sacrifices and rituals to appease the gods. And he wasn't alone. Emperors like Tiberius and Claudius were known to consult the augurs before making even minor decisions, terrified of provoking divine wrath. The irony: many of these rulers privately doubted the omens but upheld the tradition because the people believed. To disregard the birds wasn't just risky, it was political suicide. But the stakes were even higher than mere reputation. When Julius Caesar infamously dismissed a warning about the Ides of March, scoffing at the soothsayer's prophecy, his defiance became a cautionary tale. His assassination was seen as divine punishment for ignoring the signs, proof that even the mightiest weren't above the gods' whims. This fear wasn't just about birds, it was about control. By binding politics to the unpredictable will of nature, the elite maintained their grip on power. A bad omen could justify removing a rival, while a favorable one could legitimize a coup. The rituals themselves were eerily precise. Augurs didn't just glance at the sky, they divided it into sacred zones where the direction, speed, and even the species of bird carried specific meanings. A vulture circling clockwise might signal victory, while an eagle's sudden dive could mean imminent disaster. The public spectacles surrounding these readings were just as calculated, elaborate ceremonies designed to showcase the emperor's piety while masking the raw superstition beneath. What's truly chilling is how this ancient fear echoes today. We might not cancel flights over a crow's path, but how often do we hesitate because of a bad feeling or a superstition we can't quite shake? The Romans simply turned those instincts into law, and for centuries their empire moved to the rhythm of wings and omens. A sneeze in ancient Rome wasn't just a nuisance, it was a potential death sentence. While we might reach for a tissue and carry on, emperors like Tiberius treated a sudden sneeze with the same gravity as a thunderbolt from Jupiter. The sound of someone stifling a sneeze could freeze an entire courtroom, silence a debate in the Senate, or even send a servant scrambling for their life. This wasn't mere hypersensitivity. It was rooted in the belief that a sneeze was the body's desperate attempt to expel evil spirits, or worse, a sign that those spirits had already taken hold. Tiberius, notorious for his paranoia, would cancel entire meetings if so much as a whisper of a sneeze interrupted proceedings. To him, it wasn't just bad manners, it was a divine red flag. Historians recount how he once abandoned a crucial military strategy session because a junior officer sneezed during his briefing, interpreting it as a warning from the gods that the plan would end in disaster. And he wasn't alone. Claudius, often seen as more level-headed, employed officials known as sneeze monitors, men whose sole job was to note the timing, direction, and even the loudness of every sneeze in the imperial court. These records were then scrutinized by astrologers for hidden omens. But why such extreme reactions? The Romans believed the soul resided in the breath, and a sneeze, violent, uncontrollable, was a moment of vulnerability when malevolent forces could invade or escape. A sneeze to the left, a bad omen. A sneeze during a vow or prayer, the gods were rejecting the plea. Even the great physician Galen wrote that sneezes could reveal a person's fate, linking them to everything from illness to impending betrayal. The stakes were terrifyingly real. Under Nero, a servant was executed after sneezing during the emperor's poetry recital, a sign of divine disapproval that sealed the poor man's fate. And during the chaotic year of the 4 emperors, a general delayed his troops' march after 3 soldiers sneezed in unison, fearing it foreshadowed defeat. In a world where power hung by a thread, emperors couldn't afford to ignore even the smallest hint of disfavor from the gods. What's striking is how this superstition blurred the line between the mundane and the sacred. A bodily reflex we barely think about today could derail empires, spare enemies, or condemn innocents. It's a reminder of how fear, once institutionalized, twists reality, turning a sneeze into a weapon, a warning, and a verdict all at once. In Rome, the simple act of reaching for bread with your left hand could brand you as an agent of chaos. Left-handedness wasn't just a quirk, it was a cosmic red flag, a sign that you carried the shadow of the divine's disfavor. Emperors like Nero didn't merely distrust left-handed individuals, they saw them as walking bad luck charms, capable of unraveling the fragile order of the empire with a single gesture. Historical accounts suggest Nero went so far as to purge left-handed soldiers from his personal guard, convinced their presence would invite disaster on the battlefield. This wasn't just paranoia, it was policy. The roots of this fear ran deep. The Latin word for left, sinister, tells you everything you need to know. To the Romans, the left side was where darkness lurked, where malicious spirits and ill omens gathered strength. Even accidental movements mattered. During sacred rituals, an emperor's misplaced left-handed gesture could invalidate an entire ceremony, forcing days of purification and costly repeat performances. That's why many rulers employed handlers, attendants trained to subtly guide their right hands during public events, ensuring no slip-ups offended the gods or alarmed the masses. But the superstition bled far beyond the imperial court. Left-handed children were often forced to relearn basic tasks with their right hands, while traders refused deals sealed with a left-handed handshake, fearing bad fortune. The philosopher Pliny the Elder wrote that a left-handed person entering a home uninvited was an omen of impending ruin. And in the military, where precision and discipline were paramount, left-handed recruits faced brutal retraining or outright dismissal. The irony, some of Rome's greatest enemies, like the left-handed Germanic warriors, used this fear against them. Tales spread of barbarians deliberately wielding weapons in their left hands to unsettle Roman troops, turning superstition into psychological warfare. It's a stark reminder of how deeply belief could shape reality, where the difference between victory and defeat might hinge not on strategy, but on which hand held the sword. What's haunting is how this ancient bias echoes today. We still label things sinister without a second thought, proof that even the smallest superstitions can outlast empires. For the Romans, left-handedness wasn't just inconvenient, it was a crack in the foundation of their world, one they'd go to terrifying lengths to seal. To the emperors of Rome, statues were never just stone and bronze, they were sleeping giants, capable of waking with a vengeance. Imagine walking through the imperial palace at night, where the flickering torchlight made shadows dance across the faces of marble gods and deified ancestors. To a ruler like Caligula, those hollow eyes weren't lifeless, they were watching, waiting. Historians recount how he once woke in a sweat, convinced a statue of Jupiter had whispered threats to him in a dream. His response: order the statue beheaded, its limbs chained, and its remains thrown into the Tiber River. This wasn't vandalism, it was an exorcism. The terror ran deeper than one unstable emperor. Nero, during his final days, reportedly fled Rome after witnesses claimed statues across the city had turned their backs on him, a silent, collective rejection by the gods themselves. To the Romans, this wasn't symbolism, it was cause and effect. A statue's sudden crack, a streak of tarnish resembling tears, even the way moonlight caught its features at night, all were messages from the divine. And if an emperor ignored them, the consequences were dire, so they performed nightly rituals to appease these stone sentinels. Incense was burned at their feet, sacrifices left at their bases, and their mouths anointed with oil to feed them. Some emperors, like Domitian, went further, draping statues in costly fabrics or commissioning golden crowns to flatter their favor. The logic was chillingly practical. A neglected statue might seek vengeance, while a pampered one could become an ally. But why this primal fear? In a world where emperors were both men and gods, statues blurred the line between representation and reality. To dishonor one was to insult the deity or ancestor it embodied, and to risk their wrath. When lightning struck the statue of Emperor Commodus, it sparked riots. The people saw it as proof the gods had turned against him. Even the great Augustus, ever the pragmatist, carried a tiny figurine of Apollo for protection, rubbing its head for luck before every Senate address. The eerie truth: these superstitions shaped empires. A weeping statue could trigger purges, a toppled one might justify war, and a hostile effigy could seal an emperor's fate. In the end, the Romans didn't just worship their gods, they negotiated with them, stone by trembling stone. The moment daylight vanished without warning, Rome plunged into primal terror. A solar eclipse wasn't just an astronomical event, it was a divine betrayal, the gods turning their backs on the empire. Witnesses described how markets emptied, streets flooded with wailing citizens, and soldiers dropped their weapons to kneel in prayer. For emperors like Domitian, the stakes were existential. He'd retreat to a specially constructed underground chamber, its walls lined with protective amulets, and refused to emerge until priests confirmed the sun's return. Even the most hardened rulers weren't immune. When an eclipse darkened the sky during Nero's reign, he reportedly clutched a sacred talisman so tightly it left marks on his palm, whispering promises of lavish temples if the light returned. The rituals to retrieve the sun bordered on desperation. Priests sacrificed white bulls atop the Capitoline Hill, their chants rising to drown out the panic below. Torches were lit at midday to symbolically replace the vanished sun, while Vestal virgins scattered sacred herbs to purify the air. The frenzy wasn't just ceremonial, it was damage control. Emperors knew an unchecked eclipse could spark revolts, as citizens interpreted the darkness as proof their ruler had lost divine favor. Tiberius took this fear to brutal extremes. When the astrologer Thrasyllus predicted an eclipse, Tiberius had him executed, not for inaccuracy, but for summoning the event through his prophecy. In the emperor's mind, speaking the doom aloud made it real. What's chilling is how these superstitions weaponized the sky. Eclipses became political tools, convenient scapegoats for failed policies or crumbling economies. After the year of 4 emperors, Vespasian minted coins depicting the sun's rays piercing clouds, a not-so-subtle message that his reign had restored cosmic order. And when Commodus faced rebellion, his advisors blamed a recent eclipse for clouding the people's judgment. The heavens weren't just watched, they were stage-managed, their mysteries twisted to serve earthly power. The irony, Rome's greatest minds knew the truth. Scholars like Pliny the Elder wrote detailed accounts of eclipses' natural causes, yet even he hedged his bets, advising readers to carry iron rings during one to ward off evil spirits. This duality captures the empire's heart, a civilization capable of engineering aqueducts and roads, yet still trembling before the shadow of the moon. For all their conquests, the emperors never conquered fear itself. When a comet streaked across Rome's night sky, it wasn't just a celestial spectacle, it was a death sentence written in fire. The Romans called them Criniti Stellae, the hairy stars, but there was nothing whimsical about their arrival. To emperors, these blazing visitors were cosmic knives dangling overhead, each tail a blade pointed straight at the throne. The terror began with Julius Caesar. Days after his assassination, a comet burned so brightly it was visible at noon. The people didn't see a natural phenomenon, they saw Caesar's soul ascending, or his killers being marked for vengeance. Overnight, comets became shorthand for regime change, and no ruler could ignore their chilling message. Augustus, ever the political strategist, twisted this fear to his advantage. When a comet appeared shortly after his great-uncle Caesar's death, he declared it proof of Caesar's divinity, and by extension, his own divine right to rule. Coins minted during his reign bore the comet's image, transforming an omen of doom into a symbol of legitimacy. But most emperors weren't so lucky. Nero, already paranoid, reportedly collapsed when a comet blazed during his reign, convinced it heralded his downfall. His response: order every astrologer in Rome to either predict the next comet's arrival or die for failing to foresee the god's will. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Comets didn't just threaten emperors, they destabilized empires. When one appeared during the reign of Vitellius, rival factions seized on it as proof the gods rejected him, accelerating his bloody overthrow. The so-called Year of the Four Emperors saw comets invoked as justification for every coup. Each faction claiming the heavens endorsed their rebellion. Even level-headed rulers like Vespasian couldn't escape the hysteria. He famously joked about a comet's meaning, quipping it must portend doom for the king of Parthia. Not him, but his courtiers noted how quickly he sacrificed a white bull afterward. The cruel irony, Rome's astronomers knew more than they dared say. Ancient scholars like Seneca wrote that comets were natural phenomena, wandering fires obeying cosmic laws. But speaking this truth was treason. Emperors demanded certainty where none existed, forcing stargazers to fabricate predictions or face execution. Some resorted to coded language, calling comets long-haired stars in vague reports, buying time until the next celestial crisis. Others, like the astrologer Thrasyllus, survived by feeding rulers carefully worded prophecies just ambiguous enough to be right no matter what happened. What's haunting is how this superstition outlived Rome itself. Centuries later, Shakespeare would echo the fear in Julius Caesar, where Calpurnia warns, "When beggars die, there are no comets seen, the heavens themselves blaze forth the death of princes." The idea stuck, comets as celestial heralds of doom, a superstition so potent it shaped history, toppled dynasties, and turned astronomers into prisoners of their own sky. For the emperors who ruled the world, the real terror wasn't the comet's fire. It was the chaos it ignited in the minds of men. The warm, coppery stench of freshly spilled blood hung thick in the air as the priest's knife plunged into the sacrificial bull. This wasn't slaughter, it was a conversation with the divine. Haruspice, the art of reading entrails, turned every organ into a sacred text, every blemish a coded message from the gods. For emperors, these gory inspections weren't optional. They were the ultimate fact-checkers, the final veto on wars, treaties, even weddings. When Claudius found a hole in a sheep's heart on his wedding day, he didn't shrug it off, he sent his bride to be home and demanded a second sacrifice. The empire held its breath until the next set of organs passed divine inspection. The ritual was as precise as it was grotesque. Priests, their arms slick with blood, would lay out the animal's liver like a map, dividing it into 16 sections, each representing a different god's domain. A spot on the right lobe, Mars was displeased. A discolored gallbladder, Minerva withheld her favor. The stakes were life and death. Tiberius once executed 3 haruspices in a single afternoon after they misread a bull's liver before a naval expedition. When the fleet later sank in a storm, their severed heads were displayed as proof of the god's wrath and the emperor's wisdom. But the most chilling twist. Some emperors weaponized the practice. Nero, facing rebellion, staged a public sacrifice where the liver revealed traitors in his inner circle. The names matched his personal enemies perfectly, a coincidence that sent half the Senate fleeing Rome. Even rational rulers played along. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, dismissed a haruspex's warning before marching against Germanic tribes, only to watch his army crumble from plague. His later writings confessed the doubt that gnawed at him. Had he tempted fate by ignoring the signs? What's unsettling is how these bloody rituals mirrored Rome's own fragility. The empire's fate, like the glistening entrails on the altar, was messy, unpredictable, and terrifyingly open to interpretation. A single deformed spleen could rewrite history, proof that even the mightiest rulers were just men, kneeling in the dark, begging the gods for answers in a bowl of guts. 17 wasn't just a number in Rome, it was a whispered curse, a digit so tainted that even emperors flinched at its mention. While modern hotels might skip the 13th floor, ancient Romans went further, scrubbing the number 17 from their calendars entirely. The reason its Latin numerals Roman 17 could be rearranged to spell Vixi, the chilling epitaph meaning "I have lived," or more ominously, "My life is over." To a superstitious society, this wasn't wordplay. It was a death warrant written in numbers. Titus, the beloved emperor who ruled during Mount Vesuvius's eruption, embodied this terror. Historians note he fell gravely ill on the 17th day of the month, a coincidence that sent Rome into panic. His recovery was credited not to physicians, but to his frantic advisors who staged a mock funeral, tricking the gods into thinking he'd already died. The stunt worked, but the lesson stuck. 17 was a date to fear. Augustus, ever the strategist, refused to hold Senate meetings or sign treaties on the 17th, while Nero allegedly delayed his mother's execution by a day to avoid the cursed number's shadow. The superstition bled into everyday life. Roman legions avoided forming 17-member patrols, ships postponed voyages if launched on the 17th, and even taxes due on that date were quietly rescheduled. The fear was so pervasive that some scholars believe the famous Battle of Teutoburg Forest, where 3 legions were annihilated, was blamed partly on bad timing. The disaster unfolded in the 17th year of Emperor Augustus's reign. Coincidence to the Romans, there were no coincidences. What's fascinating is how this ancient dread survives. Modern Italy still treats Diciasset with unease. Many buildings lack a 17th floor, and some airlines omit the number from seat rows. The number's infamy even echoes in our language. The word hex, meaning curse, shares roots with the Greek hexakonta, the fear of 67, a multiple of 17. For all their engineering brilliance, the Romans couldn't outcalculate a superstition. In the end, their greatest minds still trembled before 2 digits proof that even an empire built on logic could be undone by the ghost in the numbers. Purple wasn't just a color in Rome, it was a loaded weapon, a shade so potent that wearing it without permission could cost you your life. The dye that created imperial purple, known as Tyrian purple, was no ordinary pigment. Harvesting it required crushing thousands of sea snails, their glands oozing a liquid that turned from putrid yellow to rich violet when exposed to sunlight. To the Romans, this wasn't chemistry, it was alchemy, a borderline sacrilegious transformation of death into divine splendor. The process reeked so strongly of rotting shellfish that dye workshops were banished to the outskirts of cities, yet the resulting fabric was worth its weight in silver. Emperors guarded this privilege with paranoid ferocity. Nero's infamous decree made it treason for anyone outside the imperial family to wear even a thread of purple, punishable by execution. The law wasn't just about status, it was about controlling what Romans saw as stolen godhood. Purple was the color of Jupiter's cloak, the hue of dawn on the Palatine Hill, and to wear it unlawfully was to impersonate the divine. When a wealthy merchant once appeared at the games in a purple-edged toga, Caligula didn't just have him arrested. He ordered the man's entire estate confiscated to cleanse the stain of his ambition. But the superstition went deeper than fashion. The dyeing process itself was shrouded in dread. Workers handling the snails often developed rashes and sores, leading to whispers that the dye carried a curse, a price for tampering with nature's secrets. Augustus reportedly refused to wear newly dyed purple for the first month after production, fearing it retained unsettled spirits from the slaughtered creatures. And when a batch of cloth emerged streaked with black during Tiberius's reign, priests declared it an omen of famine, prompting the emperor to burn the entire shipment in a public purification ritual. The irony, Rome's obsession with purple became its own kind of prison. Emperors couldn't escape the weight of the color they'd monopolized. Commodus, desperate to prove his divinity, draped himself in so much purple that critics mocked him as the Squid, while the pragmatic Vespasian famously rejected a lavish purple cloak, joking that he wouldn't pay to smell like a beach at low tide. Yet even he couldn't resist its power. His triumphant arch featured purple banners, a silent assertion that he, too, was touched by the divine. What's haunting is how this ancient fear echoes today. We've traded sea snails for synthetic dyes, but the allure and taboo of certain colors persists. From royal decrees to modern fashion laws, the ghost of Tyrian purple lingers, a reminder that power has always worn a disguise. And for the emperors who clung to it, the greatest superstition wasn't the dye's curse. It was the terrifying thought that its magic might not be real after all. A single glance could unravel an empire. In Rome, the evil eye wasn't just folklore. It was an invisible dagger aimed at the throne, and emperors armored themselves against it with rituals that bordered on madness. Tiberius, a man who commanded legions, wore a necklace of carved amber and jet, each bead inscribed with spells to deflect the curses lurking in strangers' stares. Augustus took even more drastic measures. He outlawed unauthorized portraits of himself, convinced that enemies could use them as conduits for dark magic. Imagine that the man who ruled the known world, trembling at the thought of a peasant's envious glare. The terror stemmed from an ancient belief that malice could crystallize in the eyes, transforming ordinary jealousy into supernatural poison. A child's admiring gaze, a rival's lingering look, even a slave's fleeting glance, any of them could carry the evil eye's curse. Emperors weren't just paranoid, they were trapped in a paradox. To rule, they needed visibility, statues, coins, public appearances, but every moment in the spotlight risked attracting the very forces they feared. Nero allegedly ordered the execution of a senator solely because the man squinted at him during a speech, interpreting it as a deliberate act of witchcraft. Defensive measures became absurdly elaborate. Claudius employed fastenum bearers, attendants who carried phallic amulets believed to repel the evil eye's energy. Caligula, never one for subtlety, lined his palace doors with mirrors, convinced they'd bounce curses back at their senders. Even the pragmatic Vespasian sprinkled his threshold with salt every morning, a ritual borrowed from Etruscan sorcery. The irony was cruel. These men could order executions with a nod, yet they cowered before superstitions that made them prisoners in their own courts. The evil eye's reach extended beyond the palace. Public records described trials where defendants argued their misdeeds were caused by the curse, as if it were a tangible force that could hijack free will. One merchant, accused of selling rotten grain, blamed a neighbor's heavy-lidded stare for his lapse in judgment, and shockingly, the court reduced his fine. This wasn't justice, it was mass hysteria codified into law. What's chilling is how the superstition preyed on power's fragility. Emperors knew their legitimacy hinged on perceived divine favor, and the evil eye threatened that illusion. A single rumor that a ruler had been overlooked by the cursed could embolden rebels or trigger palace coups. The historian Suetonius recounts how Domitian, after years of dismissing such fears, finally installed an obsidian obelisk in his bedchamber following a string of military defeats, desperate to ward off what he'd once mocked. The darkest twist, the evil eye's power grew precisely because they believed in it. Like a self-fulfilling prophecy, the paranoia it spawned bred instability, the very downfall emperors sought to avoid. In the end, their greatest enemy wasn't the glare of strangers, but the reflection staring back from their gilded mirrors, a man mortal and afraid despite the crown upon his head. The howl of a dog in the dead of night wasn't just a nuisance, it was a death knell echoing through the halls of power. In Rome, where every whisper could be an omen, The mournful cry of a canine was believed to carry a dire warning. An emperor's days were numbered. Caligula, already teetering on the edge of paranoia, took this superstition to horrifying extremes. After a stray dog's howl pierced the silence near his palace, he didn't just shoo it away. He ordered every dog within earshot slaughtered, their bodies piled in the streets as a grisly warning to both the animals and the citizens who might interpret their cries as rebellion. But the terror didn't stop there. Even the pets of the elite weren't safe. When Vespasian's rival senator owned a dog that howled during a Senate session, the emperor didn't dismiss it as coincidence. He exiled the man, convinced the animal's wail was a coded message from the gods about treason brewing in his inner circle. This wasn't just cruelty, it was a twisted kind of logic. Dogs held a sacred yet precarious place in Roman superstition. They were guardians of the underworld, companions to Hecate, goddess of witchcraft, and their howls were thought to carry the voices of restless spirits. A dog's cry at midnight wasn't just noise, it was the sound of the invisible world brushing against the living, a breach in the divine order that demanded immediate action. Emperors, already hyper-aware of their mortality, saw these howls as personal threats. Tiberius reportedly kept a pack of silent greyhounds, bred for their muteness, while Nero employed dog whisperers to interpret barks as either loyal praise or treasonous prophecy. The absurdity reached its peak with Domitian, who turned canine behavior into state policy. His spies documented every dog's howl in Rome, cross-referencing them with political events to decode their meaning. When a stray howled outside the temple of Jupiter on the eve of his assassination attempt, Domitian didn't flee. He doubled down, executing 3 senators whose names happened to match the syllables of the dog's barks in an ancient Etruscan cipher. The message was clear. In Rome, even a dog's yawn could be evidence in a trial. What's chilling is how this superstition mirrored the empire's fragility. Emperors ruled by divine mandate, yet a single animal's cry could unravel their authority. The howl became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Fear of it bred instability, which bred more fear. And in the end, the dogs may have been right all along. Of the 12 emperors who reportedly heard death howls, 9 died violently. Perhaps the animals weren't predicting the future, just sensing the rot at the heart of power. To the emperors of Rome, a plate of beans wasn't just a meal. It was a graveyard in miniature. These humble legumes were believed to be literal vessels for the souls of the dead, their smooth skins hiding the restless spirits of ancestors. The superstition ran so deep that Nero banned beans from all palace kitchens, posting guards near storerooms to confiscate any smuggled pods. This wasn't dietary preference, it was spiritual warfare. The fear stemmed from an infamous tragedy centuries earlier, the death of Pythagoras, the mathematician-philosopher who'd warned his followers that eating beans was tantamount to cannibalizing the dead. When enemies chased him to the edge of a bean field, he froze rather than trample the sacred plants, allowing his pursuers to slit his throat. To emperors, this wasn't just a cautionary tale. It was proof that beans carried curses even Pythagoras couldn't escape. The rituals surrounding beans bordered on obsession. Priests of Jupiter avoided touching them during sacred ceremonies, while Vestal virgins fasted from legumes for days before tending Rome's eternal flame. The slightest misstep risked angering the dead. A superstition emperors weaponized. When Claudius suspected a senator of plotting against him, he discovered a cache of black beans beneath the man's villa, framing it as evidence he'd been summoning vengeful spirits. The terrified Senate condemned the man without trial. Even practical rulers weren't immune. Vespasian, known for mocking absurd traditions, still refused to eat beans during military campaigns, fearing they'd cloud his judgment with ghostly influences. But why such dread over a staple crop? Beyond the Pythagorean myth, beans' unusual growth patterns fed the hysteria. Their tendency to swell when buried evoked bloated corpses, while their hollow stems were seen as tunnels for spirits to climb into our world. Pliny the Elder noted how beans twist violently as they grow, interpreting the movement as trapped souls struggling to escape. The darkest twist came during famines, when starving citizens avoided bean fields even as grain stores ran out. Better to die than risk consuming a cursed ancestor. The superstition's grip loosened only when Christianity rose, rebranding beans as symbols of resurrection rather than haunting. Yet for centuries, these unassuming legumes held more power over Rome's rulers than any army. A spilled bean could spark an execution. A whispered rumor about bean flour bread could empty a marketplace, and an emperor's refusal to eat them wasn't pickiness, it was survival. In the end, the dead never needed swords to overthrow an empire, just a handful of seeds, and the living did the rest. The mournful call of an owl after sunset wasn't just a sound, it was a funeral dirge playing in advance. To the Romans, these creatures weren't symbols of wisdom but winged messengers of death, their haunting hoots believed to carry the names of those marked for the underworld. When an owl perched on the Capitol hours before Julius Caesar's assassination, even his closest allies took it as divine confirmation. The gods had withdrawn their favor. The historian Suetonius recounts how the bird's cry echoed through the forum, freezing bystanders mid-step as if the very air had turned to ice. Caesar dismissed it, but Rome didn't. That single owl's call became legendary, proof that the natural world conspired against doomed rulers. Augustus learned from his predecessor's fatal mistake. His reign saw the creation of a bizarre civil service role, the noctua captor or owl catcher. These men patrolled the city with nets and noisemakers, tasked with driving every owl beyond Rome's sacred boundary before state ceremonies or military campaigns. Records from the Palatine archives reveal their pay was triple that of common soldiers, a testament to how seriously Augustus took the threat. On the eve of his triumph over Mark Antony, owl catchers reportedly cleared 17 birds from the temples, their carcasses later burned in a purification ritual so secret even the priests looked away. But the terror wasn't just political theater. Omens attached to owls carried terrifying specificity. A bird landing on a public building foretold civic disaster. One entering a home signaled the master's imminent death. Tiberius, ever the skeptic, tested the superstition with gruesome precision. After an owl nested in his palace courtyard, he ordered a prisoner to stand beneath it at dusk. When the man dropped dead of a heart attack, coincidence or not, Tiberius banned all owls from Italy, offering a bounty equivalent to a year's wages for every carcass delivered. The slaughter was so thorough that Pliny the Elder later lamented the absence of owls in Roman forests for decades. The cruel irony, Rome's fear turned the owl into a weapon. Conspirators against Caligula allegedly released captive owls near his bedchamber, their timed hoots pushing the already unstable emperor into paralyzing paranoia. And when Claudius fell ill, his enemies spread rumors that an owl had been seen plucking hairs from his statue, a sure sign the gods were unraveling his life thread. Even the empire's collapse played into the myth. On the night barbarians breached Rome's walls in 410, witnesses swore a parliament of owls circled the Senate house, their cries blending with the screams below. What's haunting is how this superstition inverted nature's order. The same bird Greeks revered as Athena's companion became, in Rome, a feathered reaper. Emperors who commanded legions and moved mountains would cower before a creature weighing less than a grape cluster. Perhaps they sensed a deeper truth: power is fragile, and empires, like owls, see best in the dark. The walls of an emperor's palace didn't just creak, they whispered treason. In a city where every shadow could harbor a vengeful spirit, the groans of settling marble or the snap of a warped beam weren't dismissed as ordinary noises. They were the voices of the dead, and no ruler took them more seriously than Domitian. This was the emperor who slept with a dagger under his pillow, who lined his corridors with polished obsidian to trap wandering ghosts, yet still fled his bedchamber 3 times in a single night, convinced the rhythmic tapping on his ceiling was the coded knocks of his murdered brother Titus. His solution: abandon the palace entirely. Over his reign, Domitian commissioned 3 new residences, each designed with increasingly bizarre anti-ghost features: door thresholds carved from rowan wood to repel spirits, corridors built in zigzag patterns to confuse them, and courtyards planted with garlic, whose pungent smell was believed to purify the air of supernatural taint. The terror wasn't just personal, it was political. Roman architecture had always blended practicality with divine protection, temples aligned to celestial events, homes adorned with apotropaic mosaics to ward off evil, but under paranoid emperors, buildings became battlegrounds against the unseen. Caligula, after hearing footsteps in an empty wing of his palace, ordered the entire section demolished, only for his engineers to discover a nest of rats behind the walls. Instead of relief, he doubled down, executing the builders for hiding malevolent spirits in the mortar. Even Augustus, despite his reputation for level-headedness, refused to sleep in any room where a previous occupant had died, insisting his architects dismantle and reassemble his bedchamber brick by brick every time he traveled. The darkest irony: these haunted houses often became self-fulfilling prophecies. When Domitian's final palace was completed, its labyrinthine layout, intended to baffle ghosts, instead helped his assassins corner him. The very walls he designed to protect him became a tomb, and in the ruins of Nero's Golden House, later emperors claimed to hear his ghostly lyre, a reminder that no amount of purple marble could keep the past buried. For all their power, Rome's rulers were never truly alone in their halls. Every groan of timber, every draft through a colonnade whispered the same terrible truth: the dead were always listening. A bolt of lightning splitting the sky above Rome wasn't just a storm, it was a spear hurled by Jupiter himself, and the spot where it struck became ground zero for imperial panic. When lightning shattered the rooftop of Tiberius's villa on Capri, the emperor didn't order repairs. He fled the island entirely, abandoning the property as cursed and commissioning an entirely new palace across the bay. The old villa was left to crumble, its blackened beams standing as a warning to anyone who dared ignore the god's displeasure. But Tiberius's reaction wasn't extreme by Roman standards, it was protocol. The sacred texts known as the Sibylline books explicitly decreed that any structure struck by lightning must be purified with elaborate rituals or demolished, no exceptions, not even for emperors. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, faced a more public crisis when lightning ignited the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus during his reign. While lesser rulers might have seen this as a personal indictment, Aurelius turned it into a lesson in humility. He ordered a week of public mourning, during which he walked barefoot through the ashes, scattering offerings of wine and barley to appease the thunder god. Yet even his stoicism had limits. Privately, he confided to his diary that the event haunted him, writing, "What fault have I given the heavens that they would burn the house of their own king?" The answer came months later when plague swept through the legions. Proof: many whispered that Jupiter's anger hadn't been satisfied. The rituals surrounding lightning strikes were as precise as they were gruesome. Priests would examine the charred earth for thunder marks, patterns believed to encode messages from the gods. A zigzag scorch meant impending war, a circular burn warned of famine, and worst of all, a strike that left no mark at all. This last omen, called the Silent Judgment, was thought to signify an emperor's hidden crimes catching up with him. Nero learned this the hard way when lightning hit his golden statue without leaving a scratch. Within days, rumors spread that the gods had found him guiltless of treason, only because his true sins were too monstrous even for divine condemnation. What's chilling is how this superstition shaped architecture itself. Roman builders incorporated lightning rods centuries before Franklin, not to divert electricity, but to trap it. Bronze tridents mounted on rooftops called fulgur conditors were designed to attract strikes, channeling the bolt into sacred pits where priests could read its meaning. Palaces had secret chambers lined with the remnants of past strikes, charred wood, melted bronze relics believed to hold residual divine power. Even the Colosseum's design served dual purposes. Its awning system wasn't just for shade but to shield spectators from heavenly fire during games. The cruel twist: lightning didn't just threaten emperors, it empowered them. When a bolt narrowly missed Vespasian's coronation parade, his quick-thinking priests spun it as Jupiter's blessing, a near miss proving the god's favor. Conversely, when lightning struck the temple of Venus on the eve of Caligula's assassination, his enemies hailed it as celestial confirmation of their plot. In the end, Rome's rulers didn't just fear the storm, they lived by its caprice, their fates written not in stars but in the sudden, blinding light that could erase empires in an instant. A shattered mirror in ancient Rome wasn't just broken glass, it was a death sentence written in reflections. While modern superstitions warn of 7 years bad luck, for emperors like Nero, the stakes were far higher. A cracked reflection didn't just foretell misfortune, it shattered the fragile illusion of divine perfection they relied on to rule. When Nero accidentally smashed a silver mirror days before the Great Fire of Rome, he didn't shrug it off as an accident. He summoned his astrologers in a panic, demanding they reweave his fractured fate through sacrifices and spells, and when flames later consumed the city. He didn't blame faulty wiring or dry winds, he pointed to that mirror, claiming its broken pieces had unleashed the disaster. The terror stemmed from a belief as old as Rome itself, that mirrors didn't just show the face, they trapped the soul. Polished bronze or silver surfaces were thought to hold fragments of a person's essence, and damaging one risked releasing that captured energy back into the world, untamed and vengeful. Emperors, already obsessed with controlling their public image, took this to extremes. Caligula reportedly inspected every mirror in his palace daily for hairline cracks, convinced even the slightest flaw could leak his power. Augustus went further, employing slaves whose sole job was to walk ahead of him with covered mirrors, ensuring no reflection could be stolen by enemies for dark rituals. But the darkest twist came in how these superstitions bled into politics. When a senator's wife accidentally dropped a hand mirror during a banquet hosted by Tiberius, the emperor didn't laugh it off. He had the woman exiled, interpreting the accident as a sign her family harbored rebellious thoughts. The shattered glass became proof not just of clumsiness but of treasonous intent. Even practical rulers weren't immune. Vespasian, known for mocking Nero's mirror phobias, still refused to let his likeness be engraved on glass medallions, fearing the material's fragility might symbolically weaken his rule. The rituals surrounding mirrors bordered on the surreal. Before important battles, generals would ritually cleanse their reflections by breathing on mirrors and wiping them with sacred olive oil. Wedding ceremonies included a moment where the bride's mirror was ceremonially shattered not for luck, but to release her childhood soul so she could be reborn as a wife. And when an emperor died, all palace mirrors were covered for 9 days, preventing his wandering spirit from getting trapped in the glass. What's chilling is how this ancient fear inverted vanity into vulnerability. A ruler's reflection wasn't just a face, it was a hostage. No wonder Nero reportedly lined his halls with distorted funhouse mirrors, warping visitors' reflections to remind them only he controlled whose image remained whole. In the end, Rome's emperors didn't just fear broken glass. They feared the truth it might reflect back, that their power, like those gleaming surfaces, was brittle enough to shatter with a single misstep. To an emperor, closing his eyes at night wasn't just sleep. It was stepping onto a divine minefield where every dream could be a death warrant or a decree from the gods. Caligula's reign turned this superstition into a bloodbath. After dreaming his sister Drusilla conspired against him, he didn't wait for proof. He had her executed at dawn, then spent weeks afterward hosting lavish feasts in her name, as if murder could be undone with wine and poetry. But the terror wasn't confined to his twisted psyche. Rome's elite soon learned to dread their own slumber, knowing a stray nightmare reported to the wrong interpreter could land them in the Tiber with stones sewn into their tunics. Dream interpreters held more sway than senators in some courts, their pronouncements capable of launching wars or pardoning criminals. Tiberius kept 3 rival Wonera critics on permanent retainer, forcing them to debate each other's readings like a macabre game show where the prize was survival. The most famous, a Greek named Thrasyllus, earned his place by correctly predicting Tiberius would become emperor, but only after narrowly avoiding execution when he sensed the princeps was testing him with a fabricated dream. The job's dangers were matched only by its absurdity. Claudius's interpreters once declared a dream about vomiting pearls meant he'd expel treason from the empire, prompting a purge that conveniently removed his political rivals. Yet sometimes these nocturnal visions reshaped history. Constantine's legendary dream of a flaming cross bearing the words, "In this sign, conquer," didn't just convert him, it altered the course of Western civilization. But for every divine vision, there were 100 nightmares twisted to serve ambition. Nero's mother Agrippina famously bribed interpreters to tell her son his dreams of being crushed by statues meant he should distrust the Senate, a lie that fueled his paranoia and cleared her path to power. Even Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, confessed in his meditations that he feared sleep, writing how dreams unlock chambers of the mind where even reason cannot follow. The rituals surrounding dreams reveal Rome's desperate bid to control the uncontrollable. Emperors slept on lion skins to induce prophetic visions, drank poppy-infused wine to ward off false dreams, and surrounded their beds with amulets carved from moonstone, a gem believed to filter deceit from divine messages. Upon waking, they'd immediately whisper their dreams to special priests who recorded them in coded ledgers, searching for hidden threats, the cruelest irony. These superstitions often became self-fulfilling prophecies. Domitian's chronic insomnia, fueled by fear of what he might dream, left him so exhausted he hallucinated assassins in broad daylight. And when a palace servant finally did stab him, historians note his last words weren't of rage or grief, but relief. "At least this death I did not dream." In the end, Rome's rulers discovered the hardest truth of all. You can command legions, build colosseums, and wear a god's purple, but no amount of power can silence the whispers of your own sleeping mind. The south wind didn't just rustle the leaves in Rome, it carried whispers of insanity on its breath, and emperors treated its arrival like an invading army. Claudius, often mocked for his stutter and limp, became ruthlessly decisive when the Auster blew in from the southern deserts. Historical accounts describe how he once halted an entire legion's march just outside Capua, not because of enemy forces or supply shortages, but because his weather priests detected the faintest shift in the wind's direction. To modern minds, it sounds absurd, but to the Romans, this wasn't meteorology. It was warfare against invisible forces. The Auster was believed to carry not just heat, but the scorched breath of Libyan sorcerers, laden with curses that could unravel the sharpest minds. The precautions were as elaborate as they were paranoid. Ships remained docked under crimson flags, a warning that the wind's madness might drive crews to jump overboard, as sailors swore happened during the reign of Tiberius. Courts adjourned when the south wind blew, with judges fearing it would cloud their judgment or inspire false testimony. Even the Colosseum's games weren't immune. On days the Auster roared, gladiators fought with blunted swords, a superstition-born safety measure in case the wind stirred the fighters to uncontrollable bloodlust. The philosopher Seneca wrote of witnessing a southern gale turn a tame poetry recital into a brawl, with patrons attributing the chaos not to wine or rivalry, but to the poisoned air. But the most chilling effect was on Rome's rulers themselves. Caligula, already volatile, reportedly grew manic during southerly winds, pacing his palace and ordering executions for imagined slights. His advisors learned to hide petitions on these days, knowing the wind's influence might turn a minor request into a death warrant. Nero took the opposite approach. He sealed himself in a windowless chamber lined with wet cloth to filter the air, emerging only after priests confirmed the wind had shifted. The irony, some historians speculate these rituals created the very instability they feared. Claudius's infamous indecision may have worsened during the Auster, not because of the wind, but because the terror of it paralyzed his court. The south wind's power wasn't just supernatural, it was political. Emperors used it as a scapegoat for unpopular decisions. When Hadrian needed to delay a costly war, he blamed the Auster for unfavorable omens, buying time without losing face. And when a southern gale coincided with a food shortage, Marcus Aurelius let the wind take the blame rather than admit to poor grain management. The wind became a silent co-conspirator, a force that could excuse failures, justify delays, or even explain away tyranny. What's haunting is how this ancient dread lingers. We still call certain winds ill or speak of stormy weather affecting moods. The Romans simply took it further, weaving the breeze into their laws, wars, and very sanity. For all their aqueducts and roads, they never built a defense against the invisible enemy that scared them most, the wind that didn't just blow but cursed. A blood moon rising over Rome wasn't just an astronomical event, it was the night the gods bled, and emperors scrambled to staunch the celestial wound. When the moon darkened to that ominous copper hue, Nero didn't marvel at the science. He saw a divine hemorrhage, a crack in the fabric of the cosmos that demanded human blood to heal. His solution: prisoners were dragged from their cells as offerings, their throats slit in synchrony with the eclipse's peak, their life force supposedly replenishing the moon's fading light. The logic was grotesquely poetic. If the sky bled, so too must the earth. But the terror wasn't just in the sacrifices, it was in the impossibility of prediction. Roman astronomers, armed with little more than bronze astrolabes and Babylonian star charts, lived under constant threat. Get the math right, and you might earn a purse of gold. Miss by a single night, and you'd find yourself kneeling in the Colosseum sand, stripped naked before a starved lion. Caligula took this cruelty further, demanding his stargazers not only predict eclipses but interpret their meaning. When one hapless scholar correctly forecast a blood moon but called it a natural shadow, the emperor had his tongue cut out for insulting the gods with dullness. The rituals surrounding lunar eclipses reveal Rome's desperate bid to control chaos. Temples would echo with the clashing of bronze cymbals, priests believing the noise would scare away whatever demon was devouring the moon. Citizens were ordered indoors, their mirrors covered lest they reflect and thus amplify the sky's suffering. Even the military stood down during eclipses, fearing battles fought under a wounded moon would curse both sides. The darkest irony, some of Rome's greatest astronomers like Claudius Ptolemy quietly documented eclipse patterns with stunning accuracy, but dared not publish their findings. To reveal the heavens' clockwork mechanics would strip emperors of their divine leverage. Better to let the people believe in bleeding moons and hungry gods than admit the cosmos moved without regard for mortal fear. What's haunting is how this ancient dread still tints our view of eclipses today. We've traded sacrifices for smartphone photos, but that primal chill remains, the sense that when the moon darkens, the rules of the world briefly suspend. The Romans simply took it further, turning awe into tyranny, proving that even the sky wasn't beyond the reach of an emperor's superstition. To tie a knot in an emperor's presence wasn't just careless, it was an act of treason written in rope and thread. The Romans believed knots held supernatural power, their twists and loops capable of binding fortunes, choking off destiny, or even trapping the soul. When Vespasian, the pragmatic general turned emperor, caught a sailor tying his sandal near the imperial podium, he didn't reprimand him, he ordered his immediate execution. To the crowd's horror, the man's crime wasn't disrespect or clumsiness. It was the silent threat of that single knot, a symbol that could, in theory, tangle the emperor's fate with every pull of its cords. This superstition ran deeper than mere paranoia. Ancient priests of Jupiter tied ritual knots in sacred cords during ceremonies, believing the act could literally bind divine favor. Conversely, untying knots was thought to release misfortune, which is why brides wore belts tied with the knot of Hercules on their wedding day. Only their husbands could loosen them, symbolically unlocking fertility and fortune. But when ordinary citizens mimicked these gestures near emperors, it wasn't tradition, it was a death wish. Tiberius once exiled an entire family because a child's knotted toy was found near his bathhouse, its innocent loops interpreted as a curse against his health. The terror of knots even shaped fashion. Senators avoided laced shoes in the emperor's presence, opting for slip-ons to eliminate any risk of tightening laces. Military officers wore ceremonial sashes pre-tied by priests, their knots sanctified to prevent accidental treason. But the darkest application came from the emperors themselves. Nero, ever the dramatist, staged public executions where victims were strangled with elaborately knotted ropes, a grotesque reminder of what happened to those who bound the imperial will. What's chilling is how this superstition weaponized the mundane. A fisherman repairing his net, a servant securing a bundle, even a child's shoelace, any of them could become evidence in a trial. The historian Tacitus recounts how Domitian used the knot superstition to purge rivals, planting knotted cords in suspects' homes and claiming they'd attempted fate-binding sorcery. The accused weren't just killed, their hands were severed and displayed as warnings, a grisly testament to the power of their non-existent spells, the cruel irony. Rome's greatest engineers built aqueducts and siege engines, yet feared a loop of twine. Their ships conquered oceans with knotted rigging, their surgeons stitched wounds with knotted sutures, but in the shadow of the throne, a simple knot became the ultimate taboo. In the end, the emperors didn't just fear rebellion or betrayal. They feared the everyday magic of human hands, the quiet power of a knot that could in their minds tie an empire's fate as easily as a sandal strap. Crossing a threshold in ancient Rome wasn't just about entering a room. It was a high-stakes dance with destiny, where one wrong step could unravel an empire. To the superstitious minds of emperors, doorways weren't mere architectural features. They were liminal zones where the divine and mortal worlds brushed against each other, and the left foot, already tainted by its association with the sinister, became a perilous liability. Hadrian, known for his military precision, took this fear to extremes. He trained a special unit of slaves called liminal bearers, whose sole duty was to lift him bodily over every threshold in the imperial palace, ensuring his right foot never violated the sacred boundary. When a new guard once startled him into stumbling left-footed across a doorway, Hadrian didn't just reprimand the man. He banished him to the sulfur mines, convinced the misstep had cursed his reign with bad fortune. The terror of thresholds ran deeper than personal phobias. Roman architects embedded superstition into their designs, carving protective symbols into doorframes and aligning entrances to avoid unlucky angles. Temples often lacked thresholds altogether, their doorways flush with the ground to prevent any sacrilegious missteps, but emperors, trapped by tradition, couldn't escape the ritual. Claudius, despite his physical ailments, insisted on being carried over thresholds even during military campaigns, delaying troop movements while servants rigged makeshift litters to hoist him across tent entrances. The absurdity reached its peak with Caligula, who ordered the execution of an architect after tripping on a newly installed palace threshold, a crime he framed as deliberate sabotage by foreign spies. Why such hysteria over a single step? Thresholds symbolized transition, and to the Romans, change was inherently dangerous. Crossing one improperly, especially with the left foot, risked angering the liminal gods, spirits who guarded boundaries. Household shrines often featured statues of Janus, the two-faced god of doorways, whose blessings were believed to hinge on correct passage. Emperors, already hyper-aware of their precarious power, saw thresholds as minefields. A single misstep could signal divine disfavor, emboldening rivals or sparking unrest among the masses. The rituals surrounding thresholds reveal a darker truth about Roman power. Domitian turned superstition into spectacle, staging public ceremonies where prisoners were forced to cross thresholds left-footed before executions, a theatrical proof that their fate was sealed by the gods. Even Vespasian, the down-to-earth emperor who mocked most traditions, drew the line at thresholds. His private letters mention a recurring nightmare, standing frozen in a doorway, unable to move as his left foot slowly turned to stone. What's haunting is how this ancient dread lingers in our language. The word sinister still carries echoes of left-footed misfortune, and many cultures today avoid stepping on cracks or thresholds in homage to old superstitions. The Romans simply weaponized the fear, transforming an everyday act into a litmus test for power. In the end, their greatest battles weren't fought at the frontiers, but in the quiet moments when an emperor hovered above a doorway, suspended between the fickle whims of gods and the crushing weight of his own fear. In the halls of imperial Rome, even a whispered name could be a weapon sharper than any dagger. The Romans believed language held primal power, that spoken words could shape reality, and reversing them might unravel a man's destiny. Nero, ever the tyrant, took this superstition to terrifying extremes. When a court poet absent-mindedly noted that his name backward, Oren, sounded like the Greek word for prayer, the emperor didn't laugh. He had the man's tongue cut out and issued an empire-wide ban on palindromes, those sneaky words that read the same forward and backward. Overnight, inscriptions were chiseled off walls, scrolls burned, and poets exiled for the crime of writing verses that could secretly undo the emperor's will. The irony: Nero's own mother, Agrippina, had once hired sorcerers to chant his name backward in rituals, hoping to weaken his growing paranoia. Instead, she birthed a monster who saw linguistic landmines everywhere. Vespasian, the pragmatic general who rose to power after Nero's fall, played the name game differently. Born Titus Flavius Vespasianus, he strategically shortened it twice, first to Vespasianus, then to the simpler Vespasian, not for convenience but to scramble any curses targeting him. His logic was chillingly practical. If enemies couldn't agree on which name to hex, their spells would scatter like arrows missing a moving target. The tactic worked. While rivals wasted fortunes on priests trying to pinpoint his true name, Vespasian consolidated power, joking that his real magic was keeping tax collectors too busy to plot against him. But the terror of names wasn't just imperial vanity. Roman children often received 3 names, the tria nomina, not for tradition but as spiritual armor. The prenomen personal name was whispered only among family, the nomen clan name used in public, and the cognomen nickname served as a decoy for curses. When a senator's son fell ill, healers would demand all 3 names, believing the sickness couldn't be lifted unless every syllable was accounted for. Even slaves weren't exempt. After Spartacus's revolt, new slaves were given intentionally clumsy names, Stumbler or Clumsy Hands, not to mock, but to make their identities unworthy of magical targeting. The darkest twist, emperors weaponized this fear. Domitian forced prisoners to recite their full names backward during trials, watching for stumbles that might reveal guilt. Caligula, convinced his great-grandfather's name held protective power, ordered every male in Rome named Germanicus to stand guard outside his bedchamber during lunar eclipses, believing their shared name would form a mystical shield. And when Claudius suspected his wife Messalina of treason, he didn't execute her. He had her name chiseled off every public monument first, a ritual unwriting meant to sever her soul from history itself. What's haunting is how these ancient fears echo today. We still hesitate before signing contracts, flinch at mispronounced names, and instinctively censor curses. The Romans simply took it further, turning syllables into siege engines, proving that the most enduring superstitions aren't written in stone but whispered on the breath of those who fear them. A single morsel tumbling from an emperor's plate wasn't just a clumsy accident, it was a death sentence written in spilled wine and shattered porcelain. When Vitellius, the gluttonous ruler infamous for his multi-course feasts, watched a roasted peacock slide off its golden platter during a state banquet, he didn't call for a servant to clean it up. He had the chef who prepared it sealed in a cellar without food or water, left to starve as the court dined above him. To modern eyes, this seems like the act of a madman, but in Rome it was protocol. The logic was chillingly precise. If the gods allowed food to fall from their chosen ruler's table, they were withdrawing their favor, and without divine backing, an emperor was just a man with a target on his back. The rituals surrounding imperial meals reveal how deeply superstition poisoned even the most mundane acts. Before every dish reached the emperor's table, it passed through a labyrinth of checks. Tasters sampled for poison, priests examined the entrails of slaughtered animals used in the recipes, and astrologers confirmed the meal's timing aligned with favorable stars. But none of that mattered if a single grape rolled onto the floor. Claudius, often mocked for his absent-mindedness, became eerily focused during meals, insisting his plate be strapped to the table with leather bands to prevent divine slippage. Caligula took it further. He dined alone on a raised platform, convinced the height would make it physically impossible for food to fall unless the gods themselves willed it. The terror wasn't confined to the palace. Across Rome, elite households adopted variations of these rituals, turning dinner parties into high-stakes performances. Slaves were trained to serve with unnatural stillness, their hands wrapped in linen to absorb sweat that might make platters slippery. Guests practiced eating with exaggerated care, knowing a dropped olive could be misconstrued as an omen against their host. Even the poor weren't immune. Street vendors hawking fried fish or honey cakes would loudly declare their offerings, blessed by Jupiter, to reassure superstitious customers that no meal, no matter how humble, was outside the god's notice. But the darkest twist came in how emperors weaponized this fear. Nero once staged a banquet where every course was secretly designed to topple spherical dishes on tilted platters, gelatin molds that quivered at the slightest jostle. As senators watched their food crash to the floor, the emperor's spies noted who panicked, who made excuses, and who dared to laugh. The results shaped his next purge. Domitian, ever the sadist, would accidentally knock over his own wine during tense political dinners, then order executions based on which guests paled or reached for amulets. To show fear was to admit you believed the omen, and thus that you doubted the emperor's divine right. What's haunting is how this superstition turned sustenance into spectacle. The Romans, who built aqueducts to feed millions and engineered grain ships to cross oceans, still trembled before a fallen fig. In the end, their banquets weren't about nourishment, but control, a reminder that even with the world at their feet, the gods could still make them kneel. And for the chefs, servants, and diners who crossed that invisible line, their fate wasn't written in the stars, but in the space between a plate and the floor. A lone owl perched in broad daylight wasn't just unusual, it was an abomination, a violation of nature's order that sent emperors scrambling to rewrite history. While the night belonged to these shadowy hunters, daylight sightings tore open a rift in reality, proving even the sun couldn't shield Rome from divine wrath. Augustus learned this the hard way. Hours before his triumphal procession through the Forum, an owl swooped low over his chariot, its wings slicing through the noon sun like a blade through silk. The crowd's cheers turned to gasps. Within moments, priests declared the entire celebration cursed. Lavish floats were dismantled, prisoners pardoned, and the victorious general himself retreated to a darkened temple to beg forgiveness from Minerva, the very goddess whose sacred bird had just humiliated him. The owl's crime, existing where it shouldn't, a living omen that darkness could invade even the brightest hour. Daylight owls carried special horror because they defied categorization. Nighttime hoots were dire but predictable, woven into Rome's tapestry of superstitions. A noon owl, though, it was chaos incarnate, proof the gods' warnings no longer followed rules. Tiberius took this threat literally, commissioning a bronze owl deterrent that clanged like war bells when shadows fell out of sync, a mechanical priest tasked with scaring off rogue omens. Caligula went further. After an owl landed on the Senate roof during a morning session, he didn't just cancel the day's agenda. He ordered every owl nest within 5 miles of Rome destroyed, their eggs smashed as if to erase the prophecy before it could hatch. The slaughter was so thorough that Pliny the Elder later wrote of farmers celebrating bumper crops of mice, their natural predators now extinct. The rituals for daylight owl encounters read like disaster protocols. Emperors who glimpsed one were expected to dismount horses, remove all purple garments lest the color attract more ill omens, and walk backward to the nearest temple without breaking eye contact with the bird. Failure to complete this absurd dance could escalate the omen's potency. When Marcus Aurelius once hesitated mid-ritual, his advisors later blamed the Antonine Plague on that single moment of doubt. Even skeptics played along. Vespasian, famous for dismissing most superstitions, still paused a military campaign after a snowy owl appeared at midday, joking to his troops that only fools ignore a feathered senator. The delay, historians note, likely saved his army from walking into a Germanic ambush. The cruelest twist, these daylight sightings often became self-fulfilling prophecies. The owl Domitian saw circling the Capitoline at dawn didn't cause his assassination, but his frantic attempts to neutralize its power did. Convinced the bird marked him for death, he launched a wave of preemptive executions so savage they united his enemies. By the time conspirators cornered him, the emperor hadn't slept in days, his chambers littered with owl carcasses he'd personally shot with a golden bow. In the end, Rome's rulers didn't fear the owl's cry, they feared what its untimely appearance forced them to confront, that no amount of purges, prayers, or purple robes could make them masters of fate. The daylight owl was truth with wings, a reminder that darkness comes for all, even when the sun hangs high. From sneezes to statues, these 24 superstitions reveal how Rome's mighty emperors were prisoners of their own fears. Their reigns weren't just shaped by military strategy or political cunning, they were dictated by the relentless dread of divine punishment, where a dropped loaf of bread or a dog's midnight howl could topple an empire. These beliefs weren't quirks, they were the invisible chains that bound rulers who commanded legions but trembled before the unseen. What's truly chilling is how these superstitions didn't just reflect fear, they amplified it. Every emperor who slaughtered dogs to silence their omens, every purge sparked by a cracked mirror or a backward name, tightened the grip of paranoia until it strangled reason itself. The same men who built aqueducts and roads, who conquered nations and reshaped the world, could be brought to their knees by a sneeze or a knot, and the darkest irony. Their attempts to control fate only made them more vulnerable. Nero's mirror obsessions, Domitian's owl massacres, Tiberius's threshold rituals, each desperate act to ward off curses became a self-fulfilling prophecy, feeding the chaos they feared. But these stories aren't just relics of a distant past, they're mirrors. How different are we, really? We might not exile left-handed soldiers or ban the number 17, but how often do we knock on wood, avoid walking under ladders, or freeze when a black cat crosses our path? The Romans didn't invent superstition, they just weaponized it, turning private dread into public law. So which of these 24 terrors unsettled you the most? Was it the bean taboo, where emperors feared eating the souls of the dead? The south wind's curse, capable of driving rulers to madness? Or perhaps the evil eye, an invisible threat that turned every glance into a potential assassination attempt? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We're all historians here, piecing together the fragile psyche of power. And if these shadows of the past left you hungry for more, don't forget to subscribe. History isn't just a record of what happened, it's a warning, because the past isn't really past. It's waiting, whispering, lurking in the cracks of our own modern superstitions, proving that fear, in the end, might be the most eternal empire of all.